Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. On the night of the 29th of November, 2025, Ukraine launched one of its most daring and symbolically charged operations of the entire war. Two Russian oil tankers from the so-called Shadow Fleet, along with multiple energy facilities deep inside Russian-controlled territory, were struck with precision during an overnight assault that lit up the Black Sea with burning steel and orange flame. Within minutes, images of the explosions raced across global news feeds. Markets tensed. Diplomats scrambled. Analysts asked the same question in different languages. Had Ukraine just crossed a fundamental threshold in the war? The timing made the attack appear like a clean act of retaliation. Less than 24 hours earlier, Russia had unleashed a large-scale bombardment on the outskirts of Kyiv, one of the heaviest in weeks, targeting air defense nodes, communication posts, and several urban districts the Kremlin claimed were militarily relevant. The symmetry of the two actions tempted observers to see the Ukrainian strike as a simple tit-for-tat response. But such a reading is too shallow, too neat, too theatrical for the complexity of this war. What happened on that night was not merely vengeance delivered in flames. It was a carefully shaped strategic message. Ukraine was not simply responding to Russia's missiles. It was trying to reshape the political terrain beneath the war itself. Kyiv knows that it faces mounting pressure from Washington and European capitals to take peace proposals more seriously, particularly as battlefield momentum tilts in Moscow's favor. Yet, no peace negotiation is possible without leverage, and Ukraine, short of ammunition and air defenses, is running low on the kind of battlefield strength that translates into diplomatic bargaining power. Thus, the attack served a dual purpose. First, it reminded Moscow that Ukraine can still reach deep into the economic machinery that funds its war. The Shadow Fleet is not just a commercial asset. It is the lifeline that allows Russia to bypass Western sanctions and continue exporting oil, effectively insulating its war economy from the pressure once expected to cripple it. By striking this fleet, Ukraine was delivering a painful message: your financial arteries are not beyond our reach. Second, the strike was a signal to Washington, a political flare across the diplomatic night sky. Kyiv was saying clearly, we will not enter negotiations empty-handed. If a settlement is coming, Ukraine must enter it with leverage that is real, not symbolic. Destroying tankers and exposing vulnerabilities in Russia's energy ecosystem creates precisely that kind of leverage, the kind that forces Moscow to recalculate its assumptions about economic safety. For Ukraine, this attack was not the opening of a new war, but the opening of a new conversation. It was a reminder that asymmetric strikes can change political incentives more effectively than conventional retaliation. Yet the decision was also risky, because targeting oil infrastructure crosses into the gray zone where civilian and military assets blur a zone where escalation becomes unpredictable. Still, Ukraine made its calculation. If Russia strikes the grids that power Ukrainian life, then Ukraine will strike the systems that power Russia's war. The night of fire was retaliation, yes, but more importantly, it was strategy. To understand why Ukraine chose to strike Russia's oil lifeline, one must look beyond the flames on the Black Sea and examine the deeper pressures shaping Kyiv's decision-making. By late 2025, the war had entered a phase in which traditional battlefield dynamics were working decisively against Ukraine. Over several months, Russian forces had pushed forward across multiple contested regions, exploiting superior manpower, artillery stocks, and replenished industrial capacity. Ukraine, by contrast, struggled to rebuild air defenses and replenish ammunition at the pace required to sustain large-scale operations. Under these conditions, trading missile for missile became strategically meaningless. It did not alter trajectories, it merely extended suffering. Kyiv understood this with painful clarity, and so it looked for leverage not on the battlefield, but in the economic architecture that sustains Russia's war machine. The decision to attack the Shadow Fleet was rooted in a brutally logical assessment. Ukraine cannot match Russia, tank for tank, battalion for battalion, but it can strike the infrastructure that keeps Russia's military funded. Oil is Moscow's financial bloodstream. The tankers operating under lax oversight, disguised ownership, and opaque insurance structures exist precisely to circumvent Western sanctions. Striking them was an act of strategic disruption, an attempt to bleed Russia economically where Ukraine could not confront it militarily. But the decision was not shaped by the battlefield alone. Ukraine also faced a different kind of pressure, one coming not from Moscow, but from Washington. The United States had been quietly structuring the outlines of a diplomatic settlement, hoping to coax both sides toward negotiations. For Kyiv, this emerging diplomatic framework was both a relief and a threat. A peace agreement under unfavorable conditions might lock Ukraine into painful territorial concessions. A negotiation entered without leverage would leave Kyiv negotiating from a position of weakness, dependent on Western goodwill rather than strategic strength. Thus, the attack on the Shadow Fleet carried a second message. It was directed at do not rush us into negotiation without acknowledging the strategic leverage we still possess or can create. Ukraine understood that the United States, wary of escalation, might subtly pressure Kyiv toward compromise. The strike was a way of resisting that pressure, asserting autonomy in a war where Ukraine often feels like both protagonist and pawn. The attack also pushed the boundaries of Western tolerance. Kyiv knows that Washington and Brussels walk a tightrope supporting Ukraine while trying to prevent a regional or global escalation. Striking Russian tankers and energy facilities stretches that rope closer to breaking. It forces Western policymakers to reconsider how far they are willing to endorse Ukrainian escalation when the risk of Russian retaliation is never abstract. And yet, from Kyiv's perspective, this escalation was not recklessness but necessity. In asymmetric wars, leverage must be created, not assumed. Ukraine is signaling that its survival cannot depend solely on defensive endurance. It must impose costs, reshape incentives, and remind Russia that economic vulnerability is a battlefield of its own. Ukraine's strike was born from strategic pressure from a shifting battlefield, from an uneasy alliance with Washington, and from the logic of a war that rewards boldness far more than passivity. In reshaping the rules of the game, Kyiv sought not escalation for its own sake, but a more equal footing in the political endgame that increasingly looms ahead. The strike on Russia's Shadow Fleet did more than destroy tankers. It pierced directly into the global economic and diplomatic architecture that has precariously held the war within its current boundaries. Energy markets, already strained by 2 years of conflict, reacted immediately. Prices jumped. Trading algorithms flashed red. shipping insurers began recalculating risks for routes through the Black Sea. What Ukraine targeted was not simply Russian infrastructure, it was a node in a global network of economic flows that binds states, institutions, and markets together. And when such a node is struck, the shockwaves are never regional, they are systemic. Western governments understood this immediately, even if they refused to say it aloud. Publicly, they reiterated their support for Ukraine's right to self-defense. Privately, diplomats in Washington, Brussels, and Berlin were rattled. The attack pushed Ukraine's conduct into a domain the West has long feared: energy warfare, a zone where civilian and military infrastructure overlap and escalation becomes difficult to contain. Strikes on power grids can be framed as punishment. Strikes on oil infrastructure can be interpreted as existential. Kyiv, of course, calculated these risks. But the West now faced a dilemma it has tried to avoid since the war began. What happens when Ukraine's survival strategy collides with Western caution? The attack tested the outer limits of Western political tolerance. It forced policymakers to confront a painful truth: supporting Ukraine's right to resist also means supporting actions that carry unpredictable regional and global consequences. This tension between Ukraine's need for leverage and the West's fear of uncontrollable escalation has haunted the diplomatic landscape for months. The United States has been quietly shaping a fragile peace architecture, one built on de-escalation, gradual restraint, and the hope that both sides might eventually see negotiation as preferable to stalemate. But Ukraine's strike threatened to unravel that architecture. It hardened Moscow's suspicion that the West was orchestrating a diplomatic trap. It injected uncertainty into European markets already fatigued by energy volatility, and it forced the United States to reassess whether a diplomatic window already narrow might now be closing. Yet, for all the unease, there was an uncomfortable recognition in Western capitals. Ukraine may have been strategically correct. If Kyiv enters negotiation without leverage, the peace that emerges could be unstable, fragile, or unjust, and a peace that lacks legitimacy is one that will not endure. Ukraine's strike then was not aimed at destroying Russia's economy, but at altering the equilibrium of incentives, ensuring that Moscow cannot dictate terms from a position of comfort. But leverage comes with danger. The line between strategic pressure and dangerous escalation is thin. Energy warfare rarely remains contained. A strike on tankers can lead to strikes on ports. A strike on ports can lead to broader regional conflict. This is the very spiral the international community fears most in hitting Russia's economic bloodstream. Ukraine changed the strategic calculus for every actor involved: the Kremlin, Western governments, global markets. And in doing so, it exposed the fragility of a peace architecture that has always depended on restraint that is now evaporating. The world now faces a new, unsettling question: can diplomacy survive when the logic of leverage overtakes the logic of stability? In Moscow, the silence that followed Ukraine's strike was more unsettling than any immediate military response. The Kremlin condemned the attack as state-sponsored terrorism, but behind those scripted words, a far more complex and anxious series of calculations began to unfold. For Vladimir Putin and his commanders, the strike on Russia's oil lifeline was not merely a tactical provocation, it was a symbolic assault on the very foundation of the war economy. Oil is not just revenue. It is Russia's geopolitical armor, the source of its endurance, the financial engine that allows Moscow to absorb losses that would break lesser states. To see tankers burning on the Black Sea was to witness the unmasking of a vulnerability the Kremlin has spent years trying to conceal. The immediate instinct within the Kremlin was rage. Hardline advisors demanded overwhelming retaliation, new waves of missile strikes on Ukraine's power grid, deeper bombardments of industrial zones, renewed attacks on the transportation corridors that sustain Ukraine's war effort. Some voices even urged hitting Black Sea ports believed to house Ukrainian drone operations. Their logic was chilling in its simplicity. Ukraine struck Russia's energy assets, therefore Russia must strike Ukraine's. Yet a second, quieter logic competed with this instinct. Putin and his inner circle understood that any excessive retaliation could trigger consequences far beyond the battlefield. Overly aggressive strikes risked strengthening Western unity, inviting harsher sanctions, or even provoking broader NATO involvement. Moscow has not forgotten that its previous winter bombardments on Kyiv, designed to plunge millions into darkness, ultimately led to accelerated Western deliveries of air defenses, a strategic setback disguised as a tactical victory. Russia now faced a razor-thin dilemma: respond forcefully enough to maintain deterrence and domestic legitimacy, but not so forcefully that it inadvertently expands the war. Beneath this dilemma lay an even deeper anxiety. The attack revealed a structural weakness. Russia has long sought to obscure its energy infrastructure as vast, exposed, and impossible to fully protect. If Ukraine can strike tankers today, it can strike pipelines tomorrow. If it can hit depots now, it can threaten refineries next month. The illusion of invulnerability, carefully cultivated by the Kremlin, has been punctured. And then there is the diplomatic dimension. Russia has signaled, however tentatively, an interest in shaping peace negotiations that would lock in its territorial gains. Ukraine's attack threatens this objective. If Moscow retaliates too violently, it undermines its own claims of being open to a reasonable settlement. But if it responds too softly, it risks appearing weak, inviting further Ukrainian strikes. Thus, the Kremlin's response will likely unfold in controlled stages. Calculated missile barrages, intensified cyber operations, targeted strikes designed to hurt without collapsing the diplomatic facade. Russia is attempting to maintain. It will punish Ukraine, but cautiously, with an awareness that the world is watching and that a single miscalculation could ignite a chain of escalation no one can control. Ukraine exposed Russia's vulnerability. Now Russia must choose between vengeance and survival. When dawn broke over Washington the morning after Ukraine's strike on Russia's oil lifeline, American diplomats found themselves confronting a reality they had quietly feared for months. The fragile peace architecture they had been painstakingly constructing was now trembling. For weeks, U.S. officials had worked behind the scenes to outline a negotiation framework built on controlled de-escalation, restored diplomatic channels, and gradual restraint from both sides. But Ukraine's attack did more than escalate the conflict. It reshaped the strategic incentives of every major player involved. The narrow path to a diplomatic settlement had suddenly become perilously thin. From Washington's perspective, the strike created three profound complications. The first was Moscow's hardened posture, already skeptical of U.S. brokered peace initiatives. The Kremlin would now present Ukraine's attack as evidence that Kyiv was acting recklessly and negotiating in bad faith. For Russia's domestic audience, the attack would be framed as a threat to global energy stability, a framing designed to justify harsher retaliation and firmer demands at any eventual negotiating table. Ukraine's strike, intended to create leverage, had simultaneously reinforced Moscow's sense of grievance. The second complication lay in Ukraine itself. Publicly, the United States reaffirmed its support for Kyiv's right to self-defense. Privately, however, American officials were uneasy. Washington understood why Ukraine struck the need to manufacture leverage in a war where battlefield dynamics had turned against it. But Washington also feared that Kyiv, feeling cornered by battlefield setbacks and pressured by evolving diplomatic proposals, might escalate further in search of more bargaining power. The concern was not that Ukraine was impulsive, but that it was desperate, driven by the fear of being pushed into a negotiation that would lock in unfavorable concessions. The third complication was regional stability. A strike on Russian energy assets risks widening the conflict in ways the United States has long sought to avoid. If Moscow retaliates by targeting Ukrainian ports, refineries, or infrastructure near NATO borders, the risk of accidental escalation increases. Energy instability could ripple across Europe, fracturing political unity and empowering anti-war factions within fragile coalitions. A single miscalculated strike could shift the conflict from a contained war of attrition into a broader geopolitical crisis, drawing the U.S. into a conflict it has been determined not to fight directly. Yet amid this turbulence, Washington also recognized a paradox. Ukraine may have been strategically correct. Without leverage, without a demonstration that it can impose costs on Russia far from the front line, Kyiv would enter negotiations weakened, dependent on diplomatic goodwill rather than strategic power. The burning tankers in the Black Sea, unsettling as they were, provided precisely the kind of leverage that could force Moscow to reconsider its assumptions about dominance. The challenge now is balance. If Ukraine pushes too far, it risks triggering escalation that could unravel the very peace it seeks. If the United States pressures Ukraine too heavily, it risks fracturing the alliance that has sustained Kyiv's resistance. If Russia retaliates too aggressively, it risks igniting a regional crisis it cannot control. And so the war enters a new, volatile chapter 1, no longer defined merely by territory, artillery, or military momentum, but by competing visions of peace itself. Ukraine seeks security and sovereignty. Russia seeks recognition of its gains. The United States seeks stability. Europe seeks survival. Between these divergent aims lies the central question that now governs the conflict. Did Ukraine's bold strike create the leverage necessary for peace, or did it ignite an escalation spiral that makes peace more distant than ever? The answer will be written not in public statements, but in the silent calculations and shadowed decisions that follow.